Welcome to When It Hits the Fan, Lane County's favorite podcast for all things emergency preparedness. Whether you're just dipping your toes into the world of emergency preparedness, or you've been building bunkers since Y2K, we've got something for you. Hosted by Lane County Emergency Management, this podcast is all about equipping you with the knowledge and resources to be prepared and stay safe, no matter what hits the fan.
Hi, Tiffany. Thanks for not blocking all of my calls after the first episode.
Hey, Devin. I'm glad we're back.
I am really excited about this topic. I won't lie. It was first on the list when we started kind of sketching out ideas, and that is all about how to get 2 weeks ready. And so I think it's probably good to start with why we say 2 weeks when for many years 72 hours was sort of that golden rule that we preached out in the community.
Absolutely. And I don't think 72 hours is obsolete. Do you? I think there are still some situations where having a 3-day supply makes sense in your car, at your desk, anywhere where even in a bad event, you think that you'll be moving from a temporary location to a more permanent location. So let's not throw out the 72-hour kit altogether. But we are looking toward encouraging people to prepare for longer, up to 2 weeks. You know, I came from the coast. We were already talking 4 weeks there. It has to do with our hazards being more prolonged, being worse, just having more that everybody needs to do, and really encouraging people to think about what 2 weeks looks like. Even the ice storm, I know you heard this too. People that thought they were prepared or had sort of rested on that 3-day standard found themselves against the wall in terms of supplies that they had on hand.
Absolutely. Everyone that I know of who was affected by the storm, myself included, walked away with a list of things that I should have been considering or I wish I would have had on hand. So I think that's really true. So not totally throwing out 72 hours, but to keep the focus on 2 weeks. What are some of the main categories people should be thinking about when they're considering putting together their 2-week kit? And this is really a shelter-in-place kit, right? We don't intend for this to be something that you load into the family van and take with you.
I think that's a great place to start. Certainly loading everything into the car is another consideration, but I think it's also a different conversation. So should we talk about what shelter in place means? Does everybody know that?
Probably not. Good call.
Yeah, so shelter in place is a protective action. When something's happened in the community, we see it with wildfire smoke, where we encourage people to stay in their homes, protect themselves from what's outside. It's also an alternative to evacuating from your home. No, I'm not going somewhere else. I'm staying in my home, and I may not be able to leave my home. So how do I prepare my home for that period of time?
I think Cascadia, the large earthquake that we're all preparing for, is where I first heard of 2 weeks ready. And the way it was explained to me, and I do need and appreciate very clear explanations, but the way it was explained to me is if the big one hits and it affects communities up and down the West Coast from Northern California upward, where do you think our little community is in the scale of the national response? Because we will need national response here to help us stabilize the situation and begin that recovery process. How do you think we compare with Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and some of those other major metropolitan areas with a much higher population? So we have to be prepared in these smaller communities to wait longer.
It's so important for thinking of it through that lens that we may not be the first priority, that we'll just, even if we are, it's going to take some time to get here, and that what resources we have in place are going to be addressing high level needs around transportation and communication and life saving, so that anything that the average resident can do to prepare themselves stands to take less from the overall mission until we get those resources. you know this and I know this, that in a disaster, there is always a period of time at the onset where there are never enough resources. So when we talk to people about preparing themselves, we're talking about mitigating that. 2 weeks ready also helps you in a shorter period of time to help others. So maybe you only need a 5 day supply, but now you've got 2 weeks and someone that didn't have the forethought or the ability to plan needs help too. That could be your neighbor, somebody that's visiting your home unexpectedly when something happens. So 2 weeks ends up being a good standard to start with, Devin. But then you have to ask yourself, what hazards am I prone to? Where do I live? How isolated am I on a daily basis? Do I live in a rural community? Do I have others that live near me on whom I can rely? And really start answering that question for yourself using 2 weeks as sort of the starting point. Do I go bigger than 2 weeks, or do I start with that 2 week standard?
Thank you, Tiffany. And with the understanding that this is all customizable, that what we're talking about today is a good starting place and a good basic plan, let's dive in and talk about the categories of items people should be thinking of for their 2 weeks ready kits. Let's talk about water, right? That is the most important thing that we can have in any sort of shelter in place, or even some of our go kits is water. What's the rule of thumb there for people's planning?
The rule of thumb for water is 1 gallon per person per day. That does not take into account additional necessarily hygiene needs that you may have. It doesn't take into consideration pets. So 1 gallon per person per day, and then some, I think is a good rule of thumb.
So for a family of 4, just for hydration and cooking, not for hygiene, we're looking at about 56 gallons to be a 2 week supply. And so that is to help get the scale for folks, ideally, what a 2 weeks ready kit should include. And I know that can take a lot of different forms. Some bottled water you really can't and shouldn't keep indefinitely in the plastic bottles. But what are some other options?
There's the 100-gallon water storage bucket that is designed for that. You can store the water, you have to change it every year or so. That plastic is designed to store water long term. Individually bottled water isn't a bad idea, but as you said, it's not designed to stay. It's not safe after a certain amount of time. And there's a sustainability issue. We're going to talk about that across the board with food and water. How do you maintain that? Is it costly? What do you do at the end of the year if you've got 6 cases of bottled water? So looking toward a more sustainable solution, larger containers that are in plastic design to store for the long term. And then to think about what you're using it for. Are you using it for cooking? Are you using it for disinfecting? Are you using it for hygiene? And so here's where you might be able to split out the type of water that you're storing, potable water, meaning water that you can consume, versus water that you're using for hygiene.
Right. So for me, I do have a larger, I think it's 60-gallon barrel that is intended for long-term storage. I still have to dump it out every year, and it creates quite the tidal wave in my backyard. But it's just hose water. And so in addition to that, I have because I'm an avid backpacker and I love to go camping, I have a gravity filter that I can pump from that into a filter to make it safe to drink, right? It's hose water, but it also sits in that barrel. And I did my best to disinfect that barrel before I filled it up. But to be on the safe side, you can also use regular household bleach and add about an eighth of a teaspoon per gallon of water and let it stand. But you have to be careful not to get the bleach that is scented or color safe with additives. And there's a lot of good information online for how to use bleach safely to sanitize water. All
Yeah.
right. What a
I think it's a great point. There's a lot of information online about all of this, right? I think the lesson in all of it, and it's not me trying to kick it down the road in terms of helping people understand, but I think our role here is to help people sort of think through their own personal circumstances. Find the list online and then think about your day, think about your environment, think about what you need to do to fine tune that list to meet your needs.
And we'll put resources and information in the show notes as well. Um, there are a lot of great resources online, but there's also a lot of real wackadoo stuff. And so we'll try to help guide people at least to a starting point where there's really solid information. All right, once you've planned out for water, I think food is really, the next most important thing. And let's talk about what types of food should be considered and what maybe doesn't work so well.
Okay. I think the biggest advice on this is to try to store food and plan on food that is as close to what you're used to doing on a regular basis as you can. So we hear a lot about Mountain House, you're a backpacker, you know about the freeze-dried food. It costs, it's expensive.
It is.
And if you've never eaten it before, this is true of anything you're packing for a kit. Try it before the very bad day. You may find you don't like freeze-dried food, or back to the cost. It may just not. It's just not a sustainable way for people to store food. So a lot of people quickly go out and buy canned food and canned storage. That's great. If you use it regularly, it doesn't last very long. And so, if you're going to use canned food as your food storage, you should be a family or a person that eats canned food on a regular basis. Otherwise, you're not going to eat it, or you're not going to think to get it out until the disaster starts. And that's me speaking from personal experience. That's what I did 10 years ago when I started packing. A suggestion that I like to make to people, because when we start talking about cost and just the practicality of it, is thinking about just rice and beans, basic sustenance. Now, you have to think about how you're going to cook it. That's true of all of these things. But those are some ideas around just basic food storage and planning.
Right. Your kid is not the time to get fancy, right? There's no Top Chef competition. It's all about keeping bellies full and having the ability to provide, nutritious and filling food. I think some of the other things, and I agree with you on the canned food, unless you are far more responsible than I am, and get that Sharpie out, date it, and you rotate it regularly, it may not be the best solution, but it is a good option.
Yeah.
Protein or fruit bars, dried fruit, non-perishables like pasteurized powdered milk. I know you told me about, I was calling it space butter, but essentially powdered butter that's available too. And so there are some of those basics that may make more sense and make more financial sense to buy in large quantity and keep fairly indefinitely for materials like that.
Absolutely. But I'm going to circle back again to, and then what's your situation, right? Walk through your day. Yes, it's basic sustenance, Devin, but if you're a person with special dietary needs, if you're a person with just a picky eater, I know old school parents are like, they'll just eat what we put in front of them, but we all know somebody who doesn't eat what is put in front of them. So to really think about that with intention. Also, to not wait until the bad day to eat whatever you've stored if it's not something you're used to eating on a regular basis. If you've decided that legumes and rice are the way you're going to go, then break out the propane, break out the Coleman stove, cook it, and understand what that looks like. It's like going camping, right? You plan the trip, but you always wind up with gaps, something you forgot, something you didn't think of. And this is no different. It's a little like camping at home, depending on the circumstances, right?
Yeah. And depending on what you choose to build your food kit, the food portion of your kit with, um, just like when you go camping, and I'm totally not speaking from personal experience, there's nothing like showing up at your campsite with some canned food and no can opener, or a bunch of vegetables you need to cut up and no like paring knife. So it may make sense to store some of those very basic essentials with your food, so that you know you'll be able to successfully prepare it.
That's why walking through it's so important.
Um, what about first aid and hygiene?
I think there are basic first aid kits out there, and walking through the types of just basic injuries, right? Cuts, burns, things like that. But less about what types of injuries and back to 2 weeks, right? So,
Right.
and how many people are you talking about covering with that first aid kit? So those are the things I would think about with a first aid kit.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely makes sense to start with a prepackaged kit. Those typically have the basics like gauze, bandages, aspirin, and then yeah, kind of doing that math of, well, how many people might I need to cover with this for 2 weeks? Uh, Make sure if you can, and this gets down to your insurance company and some of that, but if you can get a 1 month ahead supply of your prescription medications and always be have 30 days on hand, that's just absolutely critical. And that may require a little work with either your doctor or your insurance company. And then personalizing it. What are personal hygiene items that are really important? I would want a toothbrush and some floss and maybe some hand sanitizer and some bar soap. So kind of think through how you would keep yourself or your family or the folks that you're looking out for safe.
Right?
Right.
It's the basic first aid kit that you can buy off the shelf at Fred Meyer, and then it's you walking through your day. Oh, I need saline solution. I take special medication. Um, these are the types of things that I encounter every day outside the scope of a basic first aid kit.
One other category that I think gets missed a lot when people are talking about preparing a 2 week kit or any kind of kit are the tools that go into that kit. And it's sort of like the catch-all for everything we haven't really talked about yet. So what are some things as people are considering their needs in their day? What are some overall things that are probably pretty common for a lot of us?
Well, I think about walking through your day in a home and what you would need to replace those everyday items. So, flashlights and can openers, like you mentioned earlier, radios, things that require power, and then a power source to ensure that you'll be able to use those things. If you don't have electricity, you may need a camp stove to replace the stove that you usually use. Um, Matches. How do you light a fire? What types of things do you need to walk through your day and perform those tasks that you usually just do in your house without thinking about it?
Another thing to consider is whether or not you need any tools to potentially shut off your utilities. And that's something that you should work, with your utility company on to understand. They can all be a little bit different. But if there is an earthquake and you have gas, do you know how to turn that off? If there's an earthquake and pipes burst, do you know how to turn that off? And so making sure you've done the homework and you have that understanding. And if a tool is required to do that, that you know what that is, you have it, you know how to use it.
That's a great point. And you mentioned family. We haven't talked about preparing kids, but it's a really important piece of all of this. If there are children in the family, it relates to a few things we've already talked about. One is if you have pets and children in the family, getting kids involved in planning for pets is a really It's a really good approach to both, well, planning for your pets, but also empowering children to make their own plans and to have their own agency in terms of planning for a disaster. You'll be planning for the family and food, but what can kids do for themselves to pack for that very bad day in terms of food and water and the things we're talking about, but also comfort items?
Yeah, I've had the chance to help present at Safety Town a couple of times, and we're of course, very careful in how we talk about this type of thing with the kids there, but they can be surprisingly pragmatic once you sort of give them the basic outline. They may want to throw their favorite stuffy in or something like that, but they very quickly shift to, I'm going to be hungry, I'm going to be thirsty. And so that's always eye-opening and a good reminder of how resilient a lot of kids can be when engaging with these topics. Before we wrap up for today, what is your go-to comfort item in your 2 weeks ready kit?
I have two things in my comfort kit. They are photographs, a bunch of photographs that I've cut down and put in a little Altoid tin. And I have a little notebook that I've written the lyrics to songs on because I can't remember the words to songs anymore, but there are some that I really like to sing.
Ooh, I like that. I'm gonna steal your photos in an Altoids tin idea. Mine is peanut butter. That's my comfort food item.
Is
Gotta be in
it?
my kit. If it's not in my kit, it's gonna be an extra bad 2 weeks.
Well, and it's like it takes care of two things at once.
No,
It's
and crunchy,
comfort
not
and food.
creamy. Yeah, it's gotta be the crunchy
Yes.
kind. So I think I would like to acknowledge, though, that frankly, it's not possible for everyone in our community to get to where they're 2 weeks ready. It's just not. It's expensive. It takes a lot of storage room, right? Not everybody has the physical space, even when they get creative with, bins under the bed or cans of water behind the couch. It's just not achievable for everyone. And so our hope is that everybody does what they can within the resources that they have.
Thanks, Devin. That's such a good point. It's not feasible for everyone to prepare for a disaster. And I don't want it to seem daunting because we've set this 2 week standard. It is something to shoot for. But I think if someone's even able to start with that 3 day piece, it starts to take hold. And I have a couple of ideas around this. I think the first idea is that it doesn't have to happen overnight. And will you post in the chat the link to that resource that we have at the county that tells people how they can prepare for 2 weeks over a period of 12 weeks? So in 12 weeks, you do one thing every week, buy this, do this, and at the end of 12 weeks, you're ready. So I think that's a great place to start, is to not realize that it doesn't have to happen all at once. Also, that it doesn't have to be cost prohibitive. You don't have to go out and buy new things and buy all the things. I used to do preparedness events with Girl and Boy Scout troops. We'd start by going to Goodwill, looking at things they had around their home, eventually going to the Dollar Tree. And it doesn't have to be expensive. In fact, if you're talking about a kit that you're taking out of your home, you might have a lot of what you already need in the house. But ready.gov, FEMA's sponsored website, is a classic site. It has a lot of needs and in a number of different languages. But maybe the thing I'm most excited about is the new Be 2 Weeks Ready program that was just started by the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. It just dropped on their website, and it really breaks down preparedness in a meaningful way. All the things we've talked about today, your emergency plan, what are you going to plan for, water, waste, hygiene, shelter. It breaks it down in terms of sections, but also cost. And I'm really impressed with how comprehensive this program is. it really meets people where they're at and addresses preparedness for anyone in the community.
So I really appreciate the conversation. Again, we'll put some resources for all of this in the show notes. And then I'm really looking forward to the next discussion. And you will get to talk with Sheriff Harold around wildfire evacuation. So we'll get to hear from him on how he makes those decisions, who he works with, sort of what that whole process looks like. Because I know in the heat of the moment, it's not always clear to residents, and they're rightfully more focused on just kind of getting what they need and getting out. So it'll be a good conversation.
I look forward to that.
When It Hits the Fan is brought to you by Lane County Emergency Management and co-hosted by Lane County Emergency Manager Tiffany Brown and Public Information Officer Devin Ashbridge. Music is by The Love Gems. Many thanks to our listeners and guests. We are so glad you're here to help us create a more prepared community. You can find more information, including episodes and show notes, at lanecountyor.gov/fan. Sign up to receive emergency alerts at lanealerts.org. The views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Lane County government.